Hello, 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 and welcome, guys. This is our 30th episode of TransParents. I actually was adding them up last night to see just how many we had done. I was like, wow, we're at number 30. Holy cow. But with us tonight, we have Dr. Diana once again. And so we are very pleased to have her back, to have her expertise on this topic that we're going to talk about tonight. And so, first of all, my pronouns are she, her. I'll let Jenny introduce herself.
Hi, I am Jenny. My pronouns are also she, her, and you can find me on TikTok at translovingmama or on LinkedIn. I don't even know, Jenny Holder, I think.
And then, Dr. Diana, would you like to introduce yourself?
Dr. Diana Sorrentino. My pronouns are she, her as well. And for those who have not had the opportunity to hear us together previously, I have doctoral degrees in sociology and psychology. I am an affirmed woman. My life's evolution took place in 1990, 34 years ago. And would you believe January it'll be 35 years?
Wow.
I've been studying and researching gender diversity, transgender issues, the neurobiology and the physiology for over 40 years now. So I do my best to bring experience, knowledge firsthand, working with clients to be a resource where I can be. So ladies, once again, thank you for the honor of being here with you.
Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. We're so glad. And tonight, if y'all didn't miss what tonight's topic is, tonight is about exploring the science behind gender identity. And Jenny and I have spoken about this, kind of tapped into this, alluded to it over different episodes, but we knew that we were going to bring Dr. Diana back on in another episode to really go more into detail because Dr. Diana is honestly more the scientist behind this that we wanted to bring forward for y'all. So in the comments section tonight, I had listed several different articles, parts of them that went into the neurological evidence, some of it that went into the hormonal and genetic evidence, and some of it into the prenatal or in utero evidence, which we're going to cover tonight. So we'll kind of just break it down into different parts. So the first part that we're going to go into is the neurological. And in the two articles that I put in there, I just wrote like little brief synopses of them. So if you haven't read them, the first one went into a study that showed the clear differences in the brain structures of transgender individuals compared to those whose gender identity matches their biological sex. The researchers discovered certain brain regions in trans people resemble those of their identified gender rather than their biological. The second article actually reviewed several different studies and went into exploring the brain differences between trans and cisgender individuals. It highlighted that trans people's brains often show patterns similar to their identified gender. These findings suggest again that gender identity is deeply rooted in the brain structure and function, supporting the idea of being trans as a natural variation of human diversity. And within that too, I also had put a video by Dr. Roberts, I think it's Sapolsky is the way it's said, who does a lot of YouTube videos, again, on the same subject, one of which Jenny had shared with me before. And so in those videos, he explains gender is not just about being male or female. He talks about how the brain can have characteristics that don't always match the biological sex of a person. For example, some regions, again, in trans people look more like those of identified gender rather than their biological sex. So I guess one of the first questions I ask you, Diana, is can you explain how the brain structures and functions, number one, differ in transgender people, what the evidence has found?
Okay. There are a number of magnetic resonance imaging type studies that have been conducted looking at the brains of transgender women and men and comparing them to cisgender men and women control subjects. Now, the first one I'll mention is the diffusion-based magnetic resonance tomography study. This looks at the water molecules and movement of fluid in the brain. They conducted the study looking at the cisgender individuals, male and females, and recorded that the brains were totally different between the cisgender male and the cisgender female. When they examined the transgender men and women, what they found with the tomography study was that the transgender individuals had a blended brain, a mixture of the cisgender brains using the tomography study. When they used the functional magnetic resonance imaging study, which looks at the white and gray matter and the structure of the brain, they found that the trans woman, her brain was significantly similar to the cisgender female's brain, and the transgender male's brain was significantly similar to the cisgender male brain. Now, these studies were done in many cases after the transgender individual was on cross-sex hormones. And what the studies have also shown, because they've started to do research with individuals before the administration of the hormones, that the hormones will actually change the structure of the brain to be all the more concurrent with the identified sex. Now you have the magnetic resonance tractography study, which is another MRA-based study, which looks at how the neurons and the fibers are connected within the brain. So there is a clear differentiation when you look at the brains of cisgender individuals and compare them to the transgender individuals based on the studies.
Nice. And before we go further, Jeffrey, thank you for joining us this evening. He did
Jeffrey,
tag you, Jenny, and it put like your LinkedIn profile, and I thought I'd help out. And I had just actually had my notes over the comments, and so I wasn't seeing the comments, and I like clicked out. I was like, oh, let me make sure that I identify. Thank you for that, Jeffrey. Um, I think that is something that a lot of people find very interesting. And I guess would you say that right now there is more evidence that points to the hormones changing that particular area of the brain? Or do you think that truly the brain is already changing for gender identity before trans individuals start to go on hormone?
it's already starting to change or has changed. Now, I'm going to go back in time here to conception, where the embryo is beginning to develop into a fetus during gestation. All embryos are neutered, they're not
Right?
male or female. Within the first 2 months of fetal development, the genitals, barring any anomalies like androgen insensitivity syndrome, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, and a host of others, which we'll cover a little bit later. Let's just say the XX and the XY, the chromosomes, the hormones, the genetics are normal at this stage. You're going to have within the first 2 months a developing fetus that will show a penis or a vagina. The brain at that point is still immature. The brain does not develop into a masculine or feminine brain until almost the end of the third trimester. Now, the
Wow.
default value for the brain of a developing fetus is female. And it needs to be masculinized if the fetus is XY prior to birth. How does that happen? Estrogen is what masculinizes the brain, not testosterone. Testosterone will be synthesized into estrogen in the brain through the aromatase enzyme action. It's a synthesized estrogen. And that, with the linkage into the estrogen receptor pathways within the brain will become masculinized. In contrast, if you're dealing with an XX fetus, female, the brain has to work to repress and block masculinization. So, normal development, you will have a child born, a neonate, that has a penis, XY, a masculinized brain, and they move on with their life in congruence between their identity and their sex assigned at birth. The same thing for the female, XX. Her brain will be feminized because the masculinization was prevented. You have to remember the brain is default female, and her identity and her sex assigned at birth will be congruent. Now we get into the anomaly. There are 21 different variants, abnormalities in the DNA formats of 19 genes that have been clearly identified in the brain that interrupt either the masculinization or the feminization which takes place in that third trimester. So if you have an XY fetus that has the penis, but during that third trimester, the brain does not become masculinized because it's not processed properly following the estrogen being synthesized from testosterone due to complications with the estrogen receptor pathways. You have a child born with a female brain. Now, there's a client I worked with over a number of years who was just then promoted to major in the United States Army, active duty. She was allowed to transition while she was a captain on active duty. When her blood profile came in, she had 0 testosterone in her system. The chromosomes and the genetics will create the penis or the vagina, even in the absence of the appropriate hormones. So in her case, when the brain was supposed to amortize the testosterone to estrogen for masculinization, there was no testosterone to take place and become estrogen. So she had a female brain. This has been documented repeatedly through multiple studies that this is where it begins. And the variations that can occur are much broader than what I've just shared with you. But it starts in utero. That is why there's so much incongruence between sex assigned at birth and the identity of a transgender male or woman. Now, as we've touched in earlier episodes, and we used the example of the David Reamer case out of Winnipeg, Canada from 1966. When boys were born during the circumcision, one's penises was so irrevocably damaged, they took them to Johns Hopkins in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, and the individuals there convinced the family that gender is developed by nurturing, not by nature. And they convinced the family to raise the child as a girl. Minor procedure to make it look like the child had a vagina. Well, it did not work because the child's brain was not feminine. It was masculine. And in the early teen years, when the adolescent now finally found out what had taken place, ditched the female, adopted the male persona, and got on with his life, took the name David in regards to David and Goliath. The book that's available is called As Nature Made Him, which is his life story. Very well written. The point being is you cannot make someone into who they are not. If a person has a female brain with male genitals, you're not going to change their identity. If you have a person with a male identity with female genitals, you are not going to change that identity. Period.
No. I look back on my son now and it's very clear. It was always clear. Like it wasn't, but it was. And now knowing him, I can look back and go, oh, yeah, no. This makes so much more sense. So much more sense. Um, and I do think he had a very
I have
masculine
worked
brain.
with a
I mean, and he
significant number
always had
of
a masculine
parents
brain.
to help them come to an understanding of what their adolescent is going through. And when I asked the mom to reflect back to prepubescent childhood, the early, middle, and later years about behaviors and what they never really connected, they look back and go, yeah, I just didn't know what it was. So what other questions do you have for me?
Dr. Diana, I have a very specific question.
I'll try
This,
and give you a specific answer.
well, I just know you're going to give a guiding and supporting answer. This is something that actually happened recently. Someone I know and care about, I was talking to them about this, about the neurobiology of being transgender. And this person said, well, if my kid came to me and said, I'm trans, am a girl, with a penis, I would take my child and get all these tests run, all those MRIs you were talking about, try to find all those things out. And if all those were like you say they are, then I would say, okay, that's a trans person. And if they weren't, I would know that they need psychiatric help. And it was, I know how I felt about that response. I'm curious what you might say to a parent who feels that way. My concern with the science, I love the science. My concern with the science is that some people will use it to further traumatize a child or a person. Do you know what I mean? Like to weaponize that science and go, oh, well, okay, I'm going to take you and get all this stuff done. And if that doesn't match up, then you haven't proven it to me scientifically, and therefore I am not going to affirm you. What would you say to that?
Well, the first question I need to ask is, what is the age of the individual?
Let's say the child is 10 and they've been saying this for a year.
Okay. Saying it for a year is not that conclusive. I would need to know a lot more about the child's behavior, the role play, starting at ages 3, 4, and 5 through early, middle, late pubescence. If all of a sudden at age 10, a girl says, I'm a boy, or a boy says, I'm a girl, I'm not going to take it at face value. I want to know some history because there may be other factors coming into play because that would sound like it came out of left field. I acknowledged when we began the program this evening that I am an affirmed woman and that my life evolved in 1990, 34 years ago. I was 36 years old then. I knew through my childhood that there was something different about me. Things didn't fit. I couldn't describe what it was, but my role play and the fact that my father would drag me out to go hunting, to go fishing, to go camping, and the like, and all that hyper male stuff, I just went with the flow. And it wasn't until puberty hit that I was overcome by the tsunami. But still, for me, that was 1966. There was no information available. It took me a lot of years before I put the pieces together after finding some information and support groups. There is a term being kicked around by individuals referred to as rapid onset gender dysphoria, primarily around teenagers. It's not a legitimate diagnosis. And what we have found in certain cases, and I'm not saying that your example would fall into this category, but it's not out of the realm, is that there are events taking place in the life of that adolescent, or in this case, late pubescent, early adolescent 10-year-old, that make them feel that there are issues in the family structure that are not supporting them. And they believe that an alternative gender may find them more readily accepted within the family. I've been involved with a few cases of quote unquote rapid onset gender dysphoria with 14, 15, 16-year-olds, which predominantly tend to be females. And it's not gender dysphoria. There's a great deal of dysfunction taking place in the family. There may be a middle child, or there may be 4 or 5 children, and this one's feeling neglected. And it could be a means of gaining attention.
Yep.
And having a need met. So getting back to your example of the 10-year-old, If they came out within a 12-month period, I'm a boy, not a girl, or I'm a girl, I'm not a boy, and there's no history, there's something else going on, because the role play, the behavior in childhood years, the prepubescent years, would be very clear. And if that child at age 10 was persistent, insistent, and consistent in the belief that they were a gender that was incongruent with their sex assigned at birth, they'd be saying it since they were 3, 4 years old. Now, what typically happens too, you have an individual, prepubescent child, the one example I just shared. They are persistent, insistent, consistent in a gender that is incongruent with their sex assigned at birth. They are trans, period, end of discussion. You have others that have variable role play. They'll take on the female role. They have female friends during prepubescent childhood. Well, that's normal childhood development. With puberty, that goes away. The third category are those individuals who are not persistent, insistent, or consistent in a belief that they're another gender, but they have that cross-gender role play and behavioral attitude. They're gay or lesbian when they move into adolescence, and that experimental life will begin when they're about 14, 15 years of age. So it could be one of three categories. But the trans individual is usually very definitive early on that their gender is incongruent with the sex assigned at birth. Does that help you, Jenny?
It does. My experience with my son really wasn't that. I can look back and go, he was never interested in doing like girly things. He always wanted to play with the boys, and he wanted to be a little more kind of rough about things, or the girls that he did hang out with were definitely not girly. But it did kind of come out of left field, in my opinion. I thought it. I look back and I go, oh yeah, that makes sense now. But there was not really an insistence. I mean, he didn't like wearing girls' clothes so much, but he was pretty amenable to just about anything you asked him to do. And then the first obvious step was, hey, I'm a lesbian. Oh, okay. And then it was right about that 15, 16. In fact, it was a little bit before that I really started seeing just kind of some mental health decline. Like, he was very just unhappy, and we couldn't figure out why. So, I would have told you then that, based on what you just said, oh, maybe my kid isn't really trans, because I didn't have, a kid that grew up telling me like, I'm a boy. I know I'm a boy. I didn't until he was about 16. And then later he told me, hey, I knew something was going on with me as a kid. I just didn't have a word for it. I didn't know. But
well,
again,
that's not uncommon as well, as far as they're trying to figure out where they're going to fit in the equation. And unless they've been that insistent, persistent, consistent throughout prepubescence, they're still trying to sort through the puzzle. I've been there. I lived it. Now let's get back to the parent who has a tendency to want to traumatize that child by putting them through a battery of tests. Those are the parents that typically want to carve out the tumor. They would rather find a way to bury the concept than accept it and go with the flow. Because many of the parents, again, that I've been involved with early on, where they're prepubescent, is showing fluid behavior, but they're not insistent, consistent, or persistent, I just tell them, take a step back, take a shot of bourbon, go with the flow. Let's see what happens when they hit puberty, because that's going to be the break point. But for a parent that wants to put their child through MRIs and blood tests and chromosome tests and everything else, that's criminal.
Listen to the child. I think it continues to treat it. It acts as if this is a problem to solve or something to get to the bottom of, instead of, the way I see it is what everything that you talked about, what we know about the brain, what we know about that fetal development. We didn't know, we might not have known that 50 years ago. And in 50 years, we're going to know so much more. So what if you go through all this and come to a determination because of some tests you've had run and go, well, my kid's clearly not trans. And 50 years from now, we learn that there was yet another factor that could be an indicator or, a precursor or whatever. Here, you've lost that relationship with a child. You could have caused irreparable damage to the mental health of a human being. And I just don't, that was kind of where I was coming from. That was.
Yeah. Well, Jenny, unfortunately, research scientists, clinicians that do studies, they tend to be conservative people. And Amber, you can relate to this because you've been through nursing school. To find that silver bullet, to say, aha, this is the sole source,
Yeah.
they won't do it. Because in this environment, and my second book is going to, you think we've done deep dives. What do you read my second book when it's finished? There are so many contributing factors. The masculinization or feminization of the brain is just one piece of it. You have an XY fetus, the SRY gene, which attaches to the Y chromosome at level 23, if that's got an issue, you have a variance. I mean, there's so many factors. And just to give you an idea, these are some of the chapter topics from my book in development. You have androgen insensitivity syndrome, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, mild androgen, partial, congenital adrenal hyplasia, malarianogenesis. You have intersex children being born, could have XY, they look like they have a vagina. They could be XX, they have no uterus or fallopian tubes because of the agenesis of the Müllerian duct. And the list goes on. The hormonal effects on the brain of transgender men and women. I have a chapter for each one of those because the difference in the brain will already exist before cross-sex hormone administration. The administration of the cross-sex hormones will enhance the changes within the brain because they refer to the brain as being plasticity. It's flexible. I mean, the neuroscience behind this is growing exponentially almost year after year. And the majority of what I talk to you about has only been discovered in the past 10, 15 years. And it's through the studies. You have, as I indicated, the diffusion tensor tractography, the diffusion-based magnetic resonance tomography, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and diffuser tensor imaging. These all take very different pictures of the brain. And when you compare them to cisgender individuals, the differentiation is significant.
Are you
So does that fully answer your question?
It does. Are you at all concerned that if people knew this, then they would say, oh, well, now I'm going to pump my boy child full of testosterone to try to fix that or reverse it or get that brain to be more like a male brain? Does that make sense?
It would not work.
Okay.
Because the brain is already set at birth. That neonate's brain is not going to change.
Okay.
Okay? It's not going to change. Trying to do the necessary experiments on living humans is unethical. Right. Rhesus monkeys, rats, gerbils, guinea pigs have similar structures in their brains to the human brain. And they've been able to, with hormonal interventions, cross-sex hormone interventions. And there's a major influence. But to take a child after birth and to pump them with more testosterone to make sure they're male or more estrogen to make sure they're female, you'll probably kill them.
But I mean, that's their concern. that we're doing with adolescents, which, you almost can't convince them is untrue. Yeah, I can't convince anyone that I didn't take my kid immediately to the clinic and start pumping him full of testosterone. That's not what happened. But that is
Listen, you're always going to have someone who's going to try to weaponize the knowledge.
Right.
But when you can have individuals who will listen with an open mind, give you a recent example. I was invited to speak to a group of senior citizens in a retirement community. Okay? It was part of their Pride program, senior citizens, right? And we're talking people from 60 to 90 years of age. And I was warned in advance that it was going to be a tough group. There were 60 people there. I do not use a PowerPoint. I just stand on my feet and present the information verbally, answer questions, went for 90 minutes straight. What was warned to be a potentially hostile crowd was probably one of the most docile crowds that I had ever presented in front of. And the number of people who approached me afterwards and said, I had no idea. And then the few who came up and said, my daughter is gay, my son is gay, my daughter is trans woman. There were quite a few. So we're out there. And when I shared, because during my presentation, I speak about the podcast, almost every one of them wanted information on how to get to the podcast. And the podcast went through the roof for the following week after the program. And they all said the same thing afterwards. We had no idea this information was available. And when it's presented in a credible, factual manner from a credible, experienced individual who's credentialed and who's lived the life, unless I pass on the colorful metaphor, idiots, you cannot fix stupid even with duct tape. You can silence them, but you can't fix it. So
That's
what's
great.
next?
Okay. Well, actually, we covered just about everything I had there for the genetic part because honestly, it was what medical conditions, the hormones, estrogen, testosterone. So we kind of covered those. So the prenatal part, because that was one of the interesting parts that Jenny and I found fascinating. Two of the articles that I have down in comment section, one of them talks about how in utero hormones a baby is exposed to can influence who they are attracted to later in life. Researchers have found these hormones can affect how the brain develops, which in turn can shape sexual orientation. Researchers and have used different physical markers like finger length ratios to study the effects of these hormones. And then the other article observes how hormones present before birth can affect whether someone is attracted to men, women, or both. It shows these hormones help shape the brain in ways that influence their sexual orientation. So from there, can you explain, I guess, how hormones in the womb affect the development of gender identity when you talked about like some of those, we were talking about the prenatal hormones and you were talking about like the chapters in your next book, because they do kind of talk about that if the mother, her hormones are off when she gets pregnant, like these aren't necessarily things that we check for. When we get pregnant, we do a pregnancy test that looks for HCG to see if you're pregnant. That's about it. We're not looking to see what your normal hormone levels are. So if you haven't run into some kind of issue before, fertility or otherwise, you may have never been checked for this. So you have no idea that you are at some kind of, whether you have a mild case of it, a big case of it, whether you have a lack of hormone that is going to the fetus. So
Well, let
your
me give you some
experience.
numbers. Let me give you some factual numbers. In cisgender women, early follicular, the average estradiol level will range from 30 to 100 picograms per milliliter. Late follicular, 100 to 400 picograms. Progesterone, average level is about 15 nanograms per deciliter. And during pregnancy, that can hit up to 300 nanograms per deciliter or higher. Now, let's get into some really interesting numbers. During the first trimester of pregnancy, a woman's estrogen level can reach a peak of 2,500 picograms per milliliter. First trimester.
Woo!
That's quite a bump.
Yes.
Second trimester can reach a height of 7,200 picograms per milliliter on average. And during the third trimester, you'll see declining values from 6,000 down to about 3,000 picograms per milliliter. Okay? Now, keep those numbers in your head for a second. Complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, or the absence of androgen in an XY fetus, means there's not going to be sufficient androgen for the aromatase enzyme to convert it to estrogen in the brain for masculinization. And it needs the synthesized estrogen through the estrogen receptor pathways to become masculinized. So without that happening, and the mother having those estrogen levels literally through the roof. There's a woman in my church who's in the latter part of her second trimester, and she commented about how her husband's complaining that she's so hormonal. I shared these numbers with her. I said, go tell your husband that this is legitimate and to leave you alone. But the influence, because hormones are being transferred back and forth between the mother and the fetus through the placenta and the umbilical. That's normal. So if you have that developing XY fetus who has insufficient androgen to be converted with the aromatase enzyme to the synthesized estrogen in the brain for masculinization, what do you think you're going to end up with? You're going to have a child with a penis that has a female brain.
I feel like all of this really comes down to you just don't know what's going to happen, where your hormones are going to be at. You're going to have a baby. That baby's going to grow up and, just understand that there's way more to that human than their genitals, their chromosomes, and their hormones, and just love and accept them, because otherwise you're starting to get into that trying to solve a problem, and trans people are not a
Right.
problem solved.
Now, they're not a problem. Now, there are so many other variances that are outside issues of transgender identities. There was a case I was involved with. I was brought in by the psychologist to work with the parents to help them come to a better understanding of what happened to their child. Mom's pregnant, ultrasound. Mom, you're going to have a girl. Child's born. Mom and dad, you have a beautiful baby girl. Okay? So they're raising the child as a girl. Everything looks normal. Puberty for cisgendered females kicks in between ages 10 and 12, unless there's precocious puberty or delayed puberty. Well, by age 12, this now emerging adolescent, no breast development, no menstruation, no body fat distribution, no physical changes. Maybe she's a late bloomer. 14, no breasts, no menses. Now mom is really concerned. Okay? Mom takes the adolescent that was raised as a female to her gynecologist. Externally, it looks normal. Upon examination, there's no vagina. Doesn't exist. Excuse
Just
me.
like
No,
external, like
next.
labia and vulva.
Yeah, it looked perfect on the outside, but when the time for the speculum to do the vaginal exam, there was no vagina.
Wow.
So blood work is ordered, ultrasound is ordered, x-rays. The ultrasound comes back. Not only is there no vagina, there's no uterus, no fallopian tubes, and no ovaries. The gonads are there, but they've never ascended or descended. They're in stasis. Chromosome test, child's XY. It's an intersex birth. The hormones were out of whack. It was a genetic variation. The gonads never descended to become testes, so therefore there were no male genital developments. You have to remember, all developing fetuses are female until the appropriate hormones and genetics kick in. So here at 14, you have an adolescent who was raised as a girl. That's a boy. It's not trans, it's intersex.
Right.
Then you have the XX fetus. That is a girl that's raised and has all the external parts that look normal. At puberty, the breasts develop, but no menstruation. This is Mullerian agenesis, where the Mullerian ducts were never fully developed because the Mullerian duct becomes the rear half of the uterus, creates the fallopian tubes. The ovaries were there, but they were not connected to anything, just an abnormality of birth. And the conditions continue. So it's not all just transgender development. And it's structured by genetic variations, hormonal variations, chromosomal variations, and the list goes on.
See, Annie arrived. Learning lots from you as always. Nice to see you, Annie. I think we've discussed it here, and I know I discussed it with Dr. Diana on her podcast. I did Paradoxes of Gender, that I had posted a link to earlier this year. But one of the things, and I'd honestly never told anybody else about it until probably about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And was doing correspondence with a woman, another mother of a trans child in Australia. And she had written a recent blog and she sent it to me. And she was like, we had just recently met. She was like, I'd like to send something to you. And I was like, okay. And so she sends me her blog and I read it. And she starts talking about the story that when her child came to them at 2, they walked up to her and said, "Why did you make me a boy?" And she started to share within the story that for herself, in utero, she had believed she was carrying a girl
That's not
and then
uncommon.
had a boy. And then here the boy was expressing that honestly they were a girl. And I'd never heard another mom talk about this before. And because I had experienced this with my child, my oldest, who is trans. And I wrote her back and I was like, I'm kind of floored because I have never shared this with another soul. But I knew for the first 7.5 months, without a doubt, he was a boy. He was a boy. He was a boy. We planted the nursery in blues and greens. He was a boy. And like my mother-in-law had at the time had gone and gotten all pink. Everything was pink, pastel pink, everything. And I was like, it's a boy. It's not a girl. It's a boy. And my first ultrasound at like 3.5, 4 months, my the fetus was turned a direction you could not make it out. And so at 7.5 months, I actually had a family relative who was a radiologist who gave us an ultrasound, a detailed ultrasound to find out if what we were having. And when she tells me that I'm having a girl, I bawled. I cried for like 2 or 3 days. And then finally was like, okay, get yourself together because this is going to affect your in utero child that's developing. Snap out of it. And okay, it's a girl. They still detested the pink. We went out and bought everything. I still bought all the blue, all the green, all the yellow, all the purple, and like clothing because I had too much pink to start with anyway. But there was something in me that just said again, I don't need to hyperfeminize whatever is coming out because there's something within me that says this is not a girl. And I accepted it. But the second he came around and said, okay, Mom, I'm not really sure. Like, I don't know. In high school, he was like, I think I'm asexual. I think I'm agender. I honestly, Mom, I don't know, but I'm not interested. And I was like, what? Okay, whatever. And then as a freshman in college, he came out finally and was like, no, I'm trans masculine. I'm most definitely, I'm supposed to be a male. I've, I've, I've been trying to figure out how to come across to say this, how to tell you this. But looking back, Mom, I can tell you that there were so many pieces that this makes I finally feel at peace with this. And the problem is that he was not at peace with this sudden incongruence with everything he was looking at in the mirror that pointed out clearly that he looked like a girl, and that was causing his dysphoria. And he had never really experienced that until he finally made that, I guess, that assertion for himself, and then to come out and tell me about it, because it was not, he was having problems. He lived in a female dorm with a female showers, and this was causing a lot of problems with school. And so we wound up, he was just like, it's not impacting me right now, but I have a feeling school, I think I should come home. And I was just like, no, I think you should. Like, if this is that you're feeling that kind of incongruence, I'm not pushing you to be something that you're not. And that's what he was feeling, was that he was living, his words were he was living as a fraud. That
Yeah.
wasn't who he was.
Even for the prepubescent child who's insistent, consistent, and persistent, but they have an identity, it's not congruent with the sex assigned at birth. During prepubescence, you go with the flow. But prior to reaching the age where puberty is going to kick in, there is great value in having that prepubescent child, early adolescent, have time with a competent psychologist, because they have questions. They may be locked and loaded with the alternative gender, but there's a lot they need to come to understanding with. For me, it took a lot of years, because it wasn't until I found a support group and then ultimately an endocrinologist and was able to gain access to the information I needed, and then became a research junkie, digging into everything I could possibly find. And you got to keep in mind, this is pre-internet days. I was doing this starting in
Right.
1986. And the more I learned, it was so much easier for me to pull together those pieces of the puzzle. And then when I decided it was time for me to pull the trigger and socially and legally and fully evolve into the woman I was destined to be since the day I was born, it was a walk in the park.
Right. And I think that's maybe why he waited so long, was to know for sure. I don't know if he worried. I know he worried about my father, or his father. I don't
Well,
know
he
if he
was
worried
working it out on his
necessarily as
own. He
much
was,
with me. Right, right. He was, and my kid is very cerebral. There's like he's just not a feeler. He was not my feeler kid at all. Total brain, cerebral. So getting him to talk about his feelings at all is like a miracle. And I think that may have been part of why he struggled as long as he did to really kind of fully grasp it. But yeah, he looked back later at once he fully came out and was like, you didn't ever think anything about the fact that I wanted to dress exactly like my brother. I wanted to wear the same clothes that my brother was wearing. I wanted to cut my hair short like my brother. You didn't think any of these things? And I was like, honestly, I didn't know. I wasn't trying to push and
yeah.
say he's trying to be one thing or another. I
Your
did have a sister
son,
who was
uh,
very athletic and a tomboy. So
yeah,
I wasn't
Right,
trying to like
uh,
pigeonhole my kid into any kind of
right,
category. It was just
right,
like,
yeah.
you'll
right.
go where you want to go.
Amber, your
Mine never
son,
shaved his ever. Never wanted to shave under his arms ever.
Yep.
Um,
no,
I mean,
those are the classic
ever.
examples of the prepubescent child who did not express consistency, insistency, persistency of their behavior being
Right.
incongruent with their sex assigned at birth, but they knew they were different. They felt they were different. They knew something
Yeah.
was out of place, could not describe it. This was me. When puberty hit and that hormone dump came in,
Mm,
that's when the tsunami hit. And it's like, oh my God, what is going on here? I had to work through a significant number of years, almost 20 years, to get to the point where I could fully embrace who I am. Your sons, plural, and somebody that I've worked with, because my clinical practice is with adults 30 plus, the years they struggle because they don't understand how can you go speak to someone when you don't even know what you're going to be talking about or what you're feeling?
I think
Those are
when
the
we
ones that
talk
have the
about
most
that,
difficult time.
I think part of that goes into a little bit more of, unfortunately, I don't feel like our doctors are trained with enough experience with this either. The psychologists, the counselors on how to help a child, how to identify if a child is struggling with these things to help them along with it. Because just myself in two different nursing schools, we never talked about how to support the bodily autonomy of people within the LGBT community. I had one course that I took as an elective, and this wasn't even an expected elective. This was just an outside elective that I took on human sexuality that broke all of it down to the best knowledge that I had seen thus far on it to explain it to me. And this was before my child had come out. Because I remember I had walked up to this professor after class and was like, you know, my child, my oldest, is actually already looking at full mastectomies. And at the time, I think my oldest might have been 13, 12 or 13. And the teacher, the professor, just kind of looked at me and didn't say a whole lot because I was going to a Christian college. And even though they gave this class, I could tell that she was uncomfortable with that, as a Christian, and that she just didn't really want to speak to that because she brought in two nurses that had actually were, a lesbian couple that were coming in to talk about their relationship and difficulties that they had had with insurance and with getting both of their names on birth certificates and those kinds of things. And they were much more supportive and kind of like pulled me aside in the parking lot and talked to me a bit more about it. Whereas, because they even said that they noted that they could tell my professor was uncomfortable with what I had asked them. But I was already picking up that my child was feeling this incongruence because they were already looking at anatomy that hadn't even developed yet and how to get rid of it.
That's
So,
common.
and I wish he would have said more to me so that we could have talked about puberty blockers, but he didn't. And I don't necessarily
See,
know that my doctor would have known. He was very supportive when I called him at 17 to tell him what my child had just come to me about and how should I best talk to them? How do I support my kid? But if I'd said at 12, at 10, puberty blockers, I don't know necessarily what my pediatrician would have said to that and how they would have, if they would have just said, your child needs to talk to a psychologist, and wanted to stay outside of it, right? That it was a more of a mental thing that my kid needed to work through and not that they needed to support them with puberty blockers or hormone blockers of some sort. What are your thoughts on
well,
that?
on the subject of puberty blockers, they are critically essential. It's a pause button.
Right.
The gonadotropin releasing hormone analog stops the production of hormones that would normally kick in at puberty. It is not permanent. What it allows is it hits the pause button so that between the ages of 10, 14, 15, 16, it gives time for an assessment of the now emerging adolescent to make sure it's going to be fit. There could be a social transition to see how it's going to fit. And if it's not fitting, you remove the puberty blocker, gonadotropin releasing hormone analog, and puberty kicks in immediately. It's not permanent, it's a pause
Right.
button. And it takes a lot of stress off of the individual. I say it's critical, but it's even more critical for the assigned female at birth who will be transitioning potentially to male because you want to stop the development of breasts. They come in very quickly, they're mature by 16, 18, and you can avoid a very disruptive surgical process from the simple use of hormone blockers.
I think that's the one thing I regret about my son not either coming to me or realizing that earlier so that we could have prevented that. We are very blessed on my mother's side of the family. And so my son, that's going to be an extensive surgery. It's not going to be a small surgery. It's going to be a very extensive surgery. I mean, I had a breast reduction myself at 18. And so I know my mother had one. My sister should have had one. My daughter should have one.
Well,
That's
what's
a
good
lot.
about yeah, where we are today, there are so many specialized gender clinics available. Individuals have been trained, not enough, but much better than even 10, 20 years ago, where
Right.
when in doubt, an assessment can be made. I mean, I have parents come contact me and go, what should I do? Well, how old are we talking here? And if it's childhood, prepubescent, just tell me what's going on. Tell me what they're saying. Tell me what they're not saying, what they're doing, what they're not doing. And more often than not, it's like just ride the wave because there's a high probability it's going to dissipate during at puberty. If it doesn't, they're either on a track to be trans or gay or lesbian. It's
So,
not something to be fixed.
would blocking that puberty, though, um, prevent that kind of, I don't know, decision making or whatever it is, that true understanding? If you were to say, oh, well, they're going to figure it out during puberty, but you've got them on puberty blockers. Now, have you blocked that ability to figure that out or no?
No, you have not.
Okay.
Because when you incorporate the puberty blocker, it's being planned. You have an endocrinologist who's involved. You'll have the psychologist involved. The parents know where it may be going. And there's support for the individual, regardless if they're transitioning male or female. Give them a chance to put their toe in the water.
Okay.
That makes awesome sense. Yeah, the things we could have known, should have known earlier. I think that's
Yeah,
that's my
coulda, shoulda,
biggest thing
woulda.
right now, right? Coulda, shoulda, woulda. I think at this point, my bigger concern and hope is that we do actually start incorporating more into our healthcare as far as
Yeah.
training goes, so that our healthcare professionals know how to support all members of the community when they come in for care.
Yeah.
That's probably the biggest disconnect that I've seen, that I really saw between the training that I got in school, the training on the floor, and just the varied responses that people got, like whether they would be respected at all, to some respect, to a little bit respect, to no, not unless you showed me proof. Like there were
Yeah.
so many different responses. It was kind of like, okay, so here is a patient who is never going to know when they come into a hospital setting how they're going to be treated
Right.
Yeah.
as of right now. And I really, that irked me as someone in nursing school who was really passionate about making sure that all of my patients knew that I was going to be there to support them 100%, every single one of them, no matter what their needs were. And I felt like there was a major disconnect for this particular community, the trans community, the gender spectrum, the gender diverse spectrum community, on who was going to respect them and uphold their bodily autonomy that we do not question within any other aspect of our community.
Well, it's beginning to change. We have a long way to go. But 2 weeks ago, I had a meeting with the director of human resources at one of the local major hospitals, wanting me to come in to work with their DEI committee on gender diversity and transgender issues. Now, this particular hospital I have been working with for 10 years in my corporate world. She had no idea that I was an affirmed woman. I told her at this meeting because part of it was play catch up, and she was very interested in the book that's being published. And then she asked me, she said, why have you been studying this all these years? I said, you haven't put two and two together yet? She says, what are you talking about? And I shared with her that I was an affirmed woman. I mean, the questions, the intellectual, inquisitive curiosity kicked in. We
Yeah.
spent 2 hours together. And that led to being a meeting this week with the DEI committee. And that's
Awesome.
going to lead to other institutions to provide the necessary training.
Right. And I think that's the key at this point, so that we know that our children, so that we know that the community itself is supported, and that they know that no matter where they go into, whether it's a doctor's office, a hospital setting, a counselor's office, that they're going to be looked at and treated with respect like everybody else. And I think, luckily, my son and Jenny's son, for the most part, have not had these altercations where they need to go in all the time to go to doctor's visits and worry about these responses. But I know that the older communities do, and this is support that they're getting at a very, like I said, it's a very spectrum of what kind of response they get. And as a health advocate, I don't want anyone to feel like they're not being listened to for their needs. And this
Absolutely.
specific community is always, not always, but a lot of them are tender-footed to go in because they don't know how they're going to be treated. They're worried that they are going to be discriminated against. Like my son right now, trying to find a counselor to recommend for his breast augmentation. He is absolutely like not terrified, but there is this risk of putting
All right.
himself out there for
All right.
somebody else to kind of, nope, we don't do that.
All right. Two options. You can go to WPATH and look up a referral,
Okay.
or go to psychology.com and do a search, because the psychologists and counselors will list where their specialties are, who they'll work with, and a phone conversation before a counseling session will cut through the bullshit.
Well, his thing has been really our insurance. His insurance being covered has been the question mark, typically. That's the headache. Like he had a list of like 30 providers, contacted all 30. None of them actually take the insurance. So we're moving on to yet another list of providers this week. But that's
All right.
kind of been his hiccup.
Listen, for the consultation, for the approval letter, for the double mastectomy,
Mhm.
it may be just one or two counseling sessions, a couple of $100. Don't let the insurance bog you down.
Yeah, I think that's what he pretty much at this point has decided. He's just going to pay for it and forget it, just because it's
And
becoming a
many of the
hindrance.
counselors out there, when insurance is not available, like many of the individuals I work with, they have a 3-tier scale. You know, their fee may be $100 for a session, or $100 for a session, or $75 for a session, depending upon a person's ability to pay.
Right.
So there
And
are
that's
options available.
actually good knowledge for everybody who's listening to out there. If you're looking for resources, please take note of what Dr. Diana just listed. Um, and we actually are right past the hour, and so I hate to cut us off, but I'm going to, just because I try and get every single bit of this on TikTok as I can, and we're limited to 59 minutes. They need to extend that a little bit further for me because I never get a show at 59 minutes.
All right, so let's
But
wrap it up. We'll do another
yes,
one.
but we are so happy that you joined us this evening again, Dr. Diana, and we will be bringing you back again. When your books come out, I definitely want to feature you again so that we can help get that word out for your books, and so that you can talk about them more, and we can get more support for you from the community, and honestly, so the community knows where they can go to get more information. Like
All
Jenny
right.
and I talk about, we have Dr. Diana is our expert, and we like having an expert that we can
Yeah.
bring on hand anytime we have questions.
I appreciate you again so much, Dr. Diana. It's always a pleasure to see you. You give great insight, and also, sorry about my dogs. They want to be fed right now. But you answer
Take care
questions
of the
that
pups.
are
Take care of the pups.
you also answer questions that are very personal to me, which I appreciate, because I think that there are more parents out there who face these things, who hear these things, who wonder about these things too, and to have an expert really give some guidance on them is very refreshing, reassuring. I adore you both. I'm going to mute again because these babies.
Right. And
All
I
righty,
agree with
pals.
Jenny. Like, that's the reason why we bring you on, is so that if people just think we're moms, we at least have, here's an expert that honestly, we're not just like talking out the back of our heads. We have somebody that we're bringing on with more insight, who's got the experience, who's got the education that you can provide. Which is, and another reason, if you're in the comment section, if you're listening to us, that is the reason why we have in the comments on LinkedIn, I have Dr. Diana's information. And if you're on TikTok, there should be a link to her information there too for Paradoxes of Gender. I do believe I included that. It will be on the live when I rebroadcast this on TikTok. I will include it in that so they can reach out to you or Diana if they have more questions for you. And so for everybody that joined us this evening, thank you so very much for having us. I'm not sure. I've not been real good at planning up in advance on this particular show. I'm catching up with all my shows at the moment, and still battling ongoing health issues. So we will be back next week. We will have Dr. Diana on again. But until then, thank you all for joining us this evening. Good night.
Thank you.